Community Conversations or Settler-Colonial Normalization by Carey Tinsley, read by Gabriel David MP. Community Conversations was an event by Cal Poly Humboldt in the College of the Redwoods, held in Arcata and Eureka on September 18th, 19th, and 20th from 5 to 8 p.m. The following are reflections from the first night of the event. This event was promoted as an invitation for the community to come together and talk about Israel-Palestine. It was framed as an evening that would begin with a catered dinner, then a series of short presentations, an hour of Q&A, followed by plenty of time for attendants to talk amongst themselves. What it turned out to be was 1. A series of lectures that lasted most of the evening. 2. A Q&A session that lasted less than 10 minutes before it was abruptly cut short. The organizers didn't seem pleased that each other person was using the opportunity to shed light on the biased language, critical omissions, and other discrepancies that had been projected from the podium. 3. A breakout discussion session for people to talk with whomever else was sitting at their table. This portion didn't start until after the event was scheduled to have ended and while the tables and chairs were being disassembled and many people were leaving. In review, the lecture/dissertation altogether offered diverse views from different religious and secular perspectives. This, in and of itself, was well done. Yet the microphone was repeatedly handed back to only one of those speakers in particular, allowing them to act as moderator and to add unnecessary commentary in between the other speakers. This is where the format becomes problematic, because the individual being primarily platformed was also the one operating from the most biased narrative. How so? Read on. Lying by omission. When select information is being presented, but crucial context is left out, it paints an inaccurate picture while still being able to claim factuality. It is a form of deception that leads people to believe certain things through what is implied or through what is not said. This is a favorite tactic of propagandists. Because many of their statements can even be fact-checked, yet not everyone is going to dig deeper and fill in the gaps of missing information. The result is they will be left with a lopsided view of an issue, which also makes them more prone to further misinformation or a confirmation bias. On this topic, it shows up as naming Arab and Palestinian militant action more often and/or with stronger language than Israeli aggression, even though the latter is the cause of the former, and much more extreme. One speaker, a retired history professor, gave a fairly straightforward summary of the 1900s Middle East geopolitics. This was a good, objective lecture, until reaching the crux of the story we were all present to discuss, the takeover of Palestine. Regarding the major initiation of Zionist violence against Palestinians in the 1948 Nakba, she told us that the Arab nations rejected the partition plan and attacked Israel. This framing is commonly used to suggest or to openly declare that the Zionist gangs, Haganah, Ergun, Stern Gang, were fighting a defensive war when in fact they were the invaders. The so-called rejection of the partition plan was a rejection of having over 200,000 Palestinians forced from their homes and off the land. Also, by the time the Arab armies came in, Zionists had already depopulated a number of Palestinian villages. And the Arab offensive was not simply an altruistic defense of Palestinian or Arab sovereignty. The droves of Palestinian refugees arriving to the neighboring countries prompted them to try and put a stop to it. Read All That Remains by Walid Khalid or The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pape to learn more about these acts of mass violence that made way for the state of Israel. But none of that was mentioned. Though she did go on to speak of the ultimate end result of the Nakba, which was 750,000 Palestinians being displaced and at least 15,000 being killed. The problem is that without the proper context, people fall prey to the belief that all of that was an unfortunate result, a side effect almost, of a war that was initiated by Arabs and therefore they were, and still are to this day, rightfully liable for the consequences. This harmful myth is circulated profusely online and is a form of genocide denial. When narrating the history of Palestine, care is needed not to omit major elements such as this, lest one feel those false narratives, even if inadvertently. If this was a presentation given by a freshman student, they could have been docked a few points and given some homework. But from a history professor, dare I say, more is expected. Thereby, we begin to understand why some members of the audience began calling out demands for more honest and accurate language during some of the dissertations. This tension heightened as the rabbi acting as moderator continued to give her interpretations of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Some members of the audience clearly found this persistent vagueness objectionable. The central example being that all but one of the speakers refused to apply the terms apartheid and genocide to what was occurring in occupied Palestine. When pressed, they insisted that there are legal definitions that matter, and that citizens in general do not ultimately get to determine when it is officially one or the other. Okay, so let's look at those definitions. Apartheid is when people are separated and discriminated against based on ethnic, religious, national, or other identities. In the U.S., this is more commonly known as segregation, an era any person of good conscience will affirm should be left in the past and guarded against in perpetuity. Yet, it is exactly what the U.S.-funded Israeli regime is enforcing in Palestine, including within the occupied 48 homeland known in the West as Israel, but most severely in the West Bank, where homes and streets are constantly bulldozed and Palestinian families are left homeless and forced to flee. To where? To Jordan, where they don't have safe passage or citizenship? To the desert? To die? The Israeli settlers building their houses on top of the rubble of Palestinian homes and bones don't care. Nor does the Israeli government that provides troops to guard and assist the settlers in their state-sanctioned terrorism. That being said, why aren't we calling a spade a spade? Perhaps those presenters didn't read the reports of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner, or even B'Tselem, an Israeli Human Rights Watch group, which has stated unequivocally that Israel is enacting an apartheid state in all of the territories it controls. Maybe they even missed the most recent official determination and declaration by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that Israel is an apartheid state. If the courts will decide, and the highest court in the world has decided, what are we waiting for? What are they waiting for? It remains unclear. Perhaps they needed to hear it shouted from the rooftops. Well, that happened also. A member of the audience near the back of the room stood up and named the legal institutions that have determined Israel to be an apartheid state in flagrant violation of international law. She also exclaimed with the full force of her voice that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are being exterminated and that she has family there, and demanded that the moderators call it what it is. Other members of the audience, including Cal Poly Humboldt students, one of whom has seen her family members in Gaza killed by Israeli attacks, called out in support of these assertions. The moderator's response? Condescendence towards those individuals and platitudes about speaking calmly and respectfully. Perhaps if the people most affected by said conflict had been initially invited to have at least an equal platform and opportunity to speak, they wouldn't need to yell from the crowd to correct the pontifications being projected from the podium. But they weren't, so they did. Until eventually they were allowed a turn to speak for themselves from the mic, rather than only having a faculty member read a statement on their behalf, which was what had been offered up to that point. The aforementioned student, of Palestinian ancestry and with family in Gaza, approached the podium accompanied by several other students and community members who stood alongside in solidarity as she gave a passionate speech about 1. The inappropriateness of a casual dinner event to discuss an ongoing genocide. 2. The injustice of having a panel of speakers that didn't include any local Palestinian voices. And 3. The audacity of the organizers and American public to require Palestinians to perpetually audition for empathy while their country and people are being destroyed and conquered by Zionist armies equipped with American weapons and tax dollars, which is buying the blood of Palestinian families. There was a standing ovation. Following, there were prayers in Arabic and then a talk given by a leader of a Muslim community in Humboldt. This is the one other speaker who acknowledged in no uncertain terms the war crimes that the State of Israel was founded upon and the genocidal siege that was being inflicted as we speak. He also asserted that far from being violent by nature, Muslim rule in Palestine was actually far more tolerant and peaceful than subsequent Christian rule and modern Zionist rule. Then, a leader in a local Christian community gave a fairly nuanced explanation of Christian beliefs about Zionism, namely that most Christian Zionists in the U.S., who form the majority of Zionists worldwide, support Israel, not for humanitarian reasons, but for ideological reasons, which are actually anti-Semitic in nature. He also acknowledged that the U.S. is virtually the same kind of beast as the State of Israel, a genocidal settler colony. Unfortunately, he tainted an otherwise solid piece with a statement about Israel's right to defend itself, which, according to international law and ethical common sense, doesn't actually apply to a military occupier who illegally annexed the land from the indigenous inhabitants. Yet, this imaginary right to self-defense is the go-to motto for American and Israeli politicians, used to excuse their near-daily genocidal massacres, which have been perpetuated countless times over the past 330-plus days, and, in fact, over the past 76 years. There's little doubt as to why he felt it was necessary to include such a disclaimer. He stated that he's married to a Jewish woman and has some Jewish ancestries, yet he has been called anti-Semitic. This is what inevitably happens to anyone who tells the truth openly and honestly about ethnically motivated depopulation and devastation of Palestine. To shield themselves from such allegations, public figures in the West routinely make such statements that they can refer to as proof that they are not, in fact, anti-Semitic, as if opposing genocide requires qualifications. But when people are losing their jobs and being exiled from their communities for speaking up, this is the outcome. So all in all, the narrative was expanding and inconvenient truths were being brought to light. But the condescension wasn't over. Upon the mic being handed once again to the moderator, who identified herself as a progressive Zionist, there was more glossing over the gritty realities of genocide, which was only ever referred to as the conflict. Meanwhile, no mention of the almost 1 million illegal settlers in the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza, the bombings of the past 11 months, to name a few. Another example of a notable omission of relevant facts that took place as follows. The speaker referred to the democratic nature of Israel, a myth that has been thoroughly debunked in the face of Israel's blatant ethno-fascism, that is, the systematic discrimination against the indigenous peoples of the land they occupy, and then stated that Hamas and Fatah have not held elections in such and such number of years. This is another favorite method of Zionist propagandists to suggest that Palestinians must be less civilized because, look, they're authoritarian, without further explanation. This deceptive spin would lead one to believe that it is the Palestinians who are oppressing themselves. While there are examples of infighting, such as between Hamas and Fatah, those disputes are entirely the result of the overarching oppression and brutality of the State of Israel backed by U.S. imperialism. How do we know? Because before the invasion and occupation, these groups were not infighting. In fact, these groups did not even exist. Palestinians did not need to form militias of freedom fighters until their freedom was stripped away from them. Possibly with this in mind, or possibly out of plain curiosity, one member of the audience asked, "Why not?" As the speaker took a long pause to check her notes, she said, "That's a very good question. Ask your friends in Hamas." The audience interjected again, "It's because they are occupied by Israel." Why are they expected to harmonize while they are being brutalized? And for that matter, why does Hamas exist in the first place? Hint. In 1988, 40 years after the Zionist gangs ran their families out of their villages in the Nakba, and after numerous attempts at peaceful resistance over the decade, they formed militias of their own in order to resist the ongoing violence and domination perpetrated upon them by Israeli soldiers and settlers. Back to the event. Eventually, the interjections faded, especially after the sidelined group of students and pro-Palestinian advocates were given a turn to speak. But they had set the tone for the evening. She attempted to dismiss the debate with a statement about Israel doesn't control Palestinian politics. Interesting. So Israel can control and sabotage every aspect of Palestinian life, but somehow they should have a thriving civil society? Palestinians are supposed to hold elections and sustain normal political functionality while they are being prevented from having a state or even a continuous land to live on. And while Israel relentlessly robs them of life, liberty, and property? Some of the moderate members of the audience, apparently comfortable enough in their personal lives, even as the government we collectively fund commits heinous war crimes, later called such interjections rude and disrespectful in follow-up discussions. For them, unhindered demands for the truth amount to unpleasant rifts in their sense of normalcy, an infraction of proper social etiquette, as it were. But for the marginalized communities most affected by the agents and machines of war now ravaging people and planet, cries from the back and sides of the room were simply an embodiment of no justice, no peace, a rallying cry for activists across continents to let it be known that as long as our institutions are complicit in crimes against humanity, politeness will not be a priority. Oppressed people cannot be expected to suffer or die quietly, nor can their family members here in the States or elsewhere be expected to stay quiet or mind their manners, while watching their people be trapped, starved, bombed, and hunted, while other people with no such direct personal connections and attachments philosophize about peace. A colonizer's peace, where entire groups are denied their most basic human rights, is not peace at all. There is a reason the highest court in the world have ruled that occupied people have the rights to armed resistance. There's a reason occupying forces do not have the right to self-defense. As occupiers, they are, by definition, the aggressors. All violence that stems from or is caused by the inhuman and illegal occupation is their responsibility. So yes, peace is the ultimate goal, but freedom is a prerequisite. Without an unwavering demand for liberty, a proclaimed desire for peace is empty. Until liberation, talks of lasting peace will be fruitless. Ceasefire now. Arms embargo now. Dismantle the apartheid state and disarm its terrorist military now, and remove illegal settlers from stolen land and homes. Respect existence or expect resistance. And finally, free Palestine.